This week on the APUSHow, we're looking at Chapter 10, America's Economic Revolution. We'll look at the changing American population. There's going to be a whole ton of immigrants coming, and I wonder if the American white population will be cool with that. Judging how white Americans usually are, I'm sure they'll be pretty fine with it. We'll also look at transportation, communication, and technological improvements. There's going to be a whole lot of new machines and new ways of getting around and new ways of communicating with one another. I wonder if anybody will have anything important to say. We'll also look at commerce and industry. A lot of people are going to get really rich. A lot of factories are going to get built, but some people aren't going to get anything. I wonder how that will work for a lot of people. We'll also look at men and women at work. Will it work with men and women at work, or will it not work? I guess we'll see what works. We'll also look at patterns of industrial society. Who will become the haves and who will become the have-nots? What will they have? What will they not have? How will we decide who haves and who haves-nots? All this and more. We'll look at, lastly, the agricultural north. Man, if you don't get excited about learning about the agricultural north, well, I just feel sorry for you. All this and more on the APUSHow. So this week we'll be talking a lot about social and economic changes in the United States between about 1820 and 1860. So not a whole lot of politics, but considering we are in a week before the presidential election of 2020, maybe you're a little politicsed out. So maybe this is a little breath of fresh air, but a lot of society, a lot of economy, and a little bit of culture too. What do you think of that, Taft? Oh, yeah. So when we talk about an economic revolution in the 19th century, we're inevitably talking about the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution occurred because of four things. Land, in the form of natural resources, which the United States had a lot of. Labor, which the United States needed more of and would receive in the form of natural birth rates as well as immigration. Capital, which the United States would need to build a lot of. Capital is like the various machines and things you use to make a business function. And entrepreneurship, which is basically the people who organize and run and sort of create the business from the creative lens, which many people would try to fill and would lead to massive changes in the class structure of the country. The U.S. population grew massively, exponentially even, and that's evident by looking at the graph on the right in this slide. You can tell something is growing exponentially by looking at the line created by the bars in the bar graph. If that were a jump for a bike ramp, it'd be a very scary jump. How do you know? You've never even ridden a skateboard. Going back to the graph, there are two reasons for this freakish increase in population: public health and immigration. The average American woman in the early 19th century was having about 6.14 births on average during her lifetime, which is quite the far cry from the current 1.77 average. And why did people have so many babies back then compared to now? Basically, it's the product of a more agrarian society that perpetuated the idea that more children meant more help on the farm, and nowadays, not many of us are working on the farm, and kids are very expensive, so there isn't a big of an incentive to have a lot of them. Now, this 6.14 average is actually a decrease from the 18th century, but there's a key difference. Far more of the babies born during this time were reaching adulthood as improvements in public health allowed more people to live beyond infancy and childhood. The second reason was immigration. In the early 1800s, not nearly as many immigrants were coming to the country. Wars in Europe halted immigration, and the U.S. banned importing enslaved people from Africa in 1808. However, However, by 1830, those European wars had ceased to a large degree, but economic hardship persisted in many parts of Europe, in particular Germany and Ireland. With improvements in transoceanic travel as well as economic opportunities, immigration increased dramatically between 1820 to 1840, with a heavy number of those immigrants coming from Ireland and Germany. Hey, that's where my ancestors came from. What do you think of that, Taft? Well, that's not very nice to say. It's also worth noting that there was rapid urbanization as many people moved to cities, particularly in the East where economic opportunities in agriculture were decreasing, but rapidly increasing in cities thanks to urban industrialization. One particular city that grew tremendously was New York, which grew thanks to its great natural harbor as well as the Erie Canal, which connected New York to the hinterland or the western states, which helped grow its economy massively. With the population increasing so much from improved health measures and immigration, the U.S. expanded massively between 1820 and 1860 with prodigious urban growth during this time. New York, Philadelphia, and Boston all saw their populations double during this time, but other areas of the country grew tremendously as well. Small western villages and trading posts would soon become large cities, which was the case for St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Louisville. However, with the completion of the Erie Canal, the Great Lakes would become much more easily connected to the East Coast, and thus large cities would emerge in that region like Milwaukee, Buffalo, Detroit, Cleveland, and most importantly, the mighty and wonderful city of Chicago. Immigration surged incredibly during this time as well. In cities like New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis, immigrants composed of at least half of the population, if not more, by 1860. The mostly European immigrants came from all over Europe, from places like England, France, Scandinavia, Italy, Poland, and Holland, but the majority of the migrants were Irish and German, as we see in the graph in the slide. German immigrants, because they were either unhappy with liberal reforms in their own region or they were displaced because of the Industrial Revolution, would come and settle in what is now known as the Midwest in states like Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois, which is why you have a lot of people with German-sounding last names like me, Mr. Weber, and my co-host here, William Howard Taft. Yes, Taft, I would agree. You are much more cat than you are German. The Irish, on the other hand, largely came over because they were being exploited by the English, who ruled over Ireland, and the Irish also experienced a severe potato famine in the 1840s. Other crops in Ireland also experienced a shortage because of widespread crop diseases, or blights as they were called, but as potatoes were the most important staple crop to the Irish, their failure meant Irish failure. Fun fact, the English actually could have mitigated the disasters of the potato famine by distributing crops grown in Ireland like oats and grain that were meant to be exported. But the English chose to export those crops rather than feed the Irish so that the English could make more money. The English were very, very kind to the Irish. Not. Nonetheless, the potato famine drove millions of Irish to America, where they settled heavily in the East with little more than the clothes on their back. The Germans, however, had a decent amount of money when they came over and found their experience as immigrants a little bit more tolerable. Regardless of their origin, most immigrants did not really settle much in the South. There weren't really many urban centers to find work in the South because the region was still heavily agrarian, not urban, and the opportunities for work in agriculture were mostly occupied by enslaved African people. The reaction to immigration was a little complex. Businessmen were hopeful the immigrants could keep labor plentiful and cheap, and Western politicians were hopeful the immigrants could grow their populations and increase the influence of the West on the national political scene. However, many Americans viewed the rise in immigration with fear and trepidation. Sometimes this fear manifested itself as simple racism, as these nativist groups would label the new immigrants as inferior to the more native Americans. Mind you, there was little awareness of the irony that these same nativists were descended from immigrants themselves only a few generations prior. There was also a strong anti-Catholic sentiment, as many of these immigrants were Catholic, and fostering anti-Catholic sentiment allowed certain politicians to win votes. These anti-immigrant feelings would create political organizations dedicated to fighting against immigration. The first would be the Native American Party, formed in Philadelphia in 1845. The Native American Party had no idea of the irony of their name because they didn't know that the name of Native Americans would become the name for the indigenous people who were actually anti-immigrant themselves, but considering what happened to many of the Native Americans, it's pretty understandable that they would be anti-immigrant towards Europeans. Groups of natives would combine and form the Supreme Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. They advocated for the banning of Catholics from public office and for the institution of much tighter laws on immigration and the acquisition of citizenship. However, their organization was secret, and the password used for this group was, "I know nothing." Eventually, the group became known as the Know Nothings, which is an insulting name for their party that has kind of stuck over the years. They would eventually become the American Party and found a little bit of success in the 1854 election in the Northeast, but the success was short-lived and isolated. Now that we've gotten a look at the people that changed American society, let's take a look at the technology, and particularly the transportation technology that would completely transform the nation. We start with canals. America saw the growth of roads between 1790 and 1820, but those roads weren't all that great, and land travel could only go as fast as the horses that carried whatever it was they were carrying. Boats are way better for carrying large shipments, and a massive improvement in boat travel had occurred: the steamboat. The steamboat allowed shipments to now travel upstream on a river, which dramatically reduced travel times because you didn't have to depend on river currents. But boats can only travel when there's sufficient water, and waterways did not always go where you need them to go. So what do you do when the water won't take you where you need to go, Taft? Well, no, water is actually quite essential to life and was very essential for travel back then. The answer is you build a river, aka a canal. So building a canal was incredibly expensive, far too expensive for private companies to take on. So states would have to take on this project. New York led the way with the construction of the Erie Canal, which connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie and therefore the Great Lakes. The man-made Erie Canal stretched 350 miles and took 8 years to build. It was the greatest feat of engineering in the United States up to that point and was immediately profitable. Tolls from the canal paid for all of the construction expenses within 7 years. This would further connect the Midwest to the East Coast, would massively increase the capacity of the American economy, and it assured New York City to become the U.S.'s most important city for generations to come. Cities that could not create canals that connected themselves with the Midwest, or the hinterland, as your book calls it, didn't find themselves disconnected from the American economy for long, thanks to a big innovation in railroads. Railroads would become a gigantic deal as they were the principal means of transportation until interstate highways were built in the mid-20th century. The railroad is essentially based on steam power locomotives, which meant they needed a good deal of coal to create the steam, as well as tracks on which they could run, and finally rail cars to carry people and goods. Railroad technology was shaky at first, but soon longer and longer track networks emerged, but not without competition from canals. States and companies that owned canals rightfully worried that the railroads would limit traffic on the canals and the profitability of the canals would be lost. New York even banned the construction of railroads for a while because of this. When faced head-to-head, railroads almost always beat out canals as a source of transportation. By 1850, the triumph of the rails was all but complete. The amount of tracks had tripled in 10 years, and track networks reached west of the Mississippi River. And short lines would consolidate to form longer lines to better connect the country. These longer lines would be known as trunk lines, which better connected the west and the east and caused the west to be better connected to the north, as it depended less on the Mississippi River for the transportation of goods and people. The South, which favored a more agrarian economy, was slow to get on board with railroads, which would really hurt them in the future when they had to move things fast over land, like, I don't know, during a civil war. Along with innovations in transportation, innovations in communication and journalism developed as well. Telegraph lines would first develop along railroad tracks to better communicate train schedules and routes, but soon the telegraph would extend beyond this role and have profound influence on the world. Telegraph lines were relatively easy to build and allowed information to travel instantly rather than by weeks via human travel. By 1861, nearly 50,000 miles of telegraph line had been built and stretched across the entire continent. For the most part, these lines were owned by a single company, the Western Union Telegraph Company, which is actually still in business to this day. They don't really do telegraphs anymore. We kind of have the internet now. Along with the telegraph, new journalism methods would revolutionize the nation. A new means of printing, the rotary press, allowed newspapers to be printed more cheaply and quickly. This allowed more newspapers to emerge and circulate throughout the country. The major newspapers from this time would come from New York City, which had the budget to provide accurate news and the means to distribute these newspapers all across the country. They would also fuel sectional discord as the South struggled to produce newspapers as well as the North. This would also fuel sectional discord as the South struggled to produce newspapers as well as the North could produce newspapers. Southern newspapers were mostly local and failed to share news beyond their local community. The Northern newspapers, on the other hand, stretched everywhere, which meant their perspective could pervade all corners of the United States. With massive improvements in transportation as well as a rapidly expanding economy, the potential for American business seemed nearly infinite. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States had developed systems of industrial capitalism which allowed for the monstrous production of all sorts of goods, which allowed the possibility for absurd profits when sold. However, these profits were not exactly shared very well, as is often the case of intensely capitalist economies. However, these profits were not exactly shared very well, as is often the case of intensely capitalist economies. During this time, business expanded profoundly as a new generation of ruthless and bold entrepreneurs came in, generated massive profits, which allowed them to secure legendary amounts of wealth to use for what came to be known as conspicuous consumption, which basically means you buy so much stuff that people notice that you bought a lot of stuff. What also helped the expansion of business was the growth of the corporation. Most businesses were still owned by an individual or maybe a partnership, but a corporation allowed many people to own a business based on how much of a percentage, aka the amount of shares, of that corporation that person or people bought. And you could get more money to grow your company by creating more pieces of ownership, again, known as shares, for people to buy. New laws made it easier to start a corporation as well as a system of limited liability within that corporation. Not to get too business classy, but limited liability basically means that if that corporation fails, you only lose the value of your investment in that company rather than the value of the whole company itself. So if Taft here were to have a company and I paid $20 for a share of it, if Taft's company goes bankrupt, I just lose that $20. I don't lose everything. Taft, don't ruin the business, please. So you could, in theory, make a lot of money by owning a bunch of pieces of a bunch of companies, and as long as those companies were profitable, or most of them were profitable, you could make a lot of money with a little chance of losing all that money, because what are the odds of all of those companies and the entire economy failing? Right, Taft? Man, you're ominous. Oh, is that why you bite people, including me? However, investments were often not enough to support the freakish Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle-like growth of the American economy. They needed loans. They needed credit. But there was not a national bank that could really do this. Thanks, Andrew Jackson. And the government still limited currency to only represent gold and silver. There was not enough gold and silver to support the growth at that time, but some state and local banks tried to issue loans they couldn't afford anyway. This caused numerous panics and bank failures, and thus deposits in banks were often insecure. All of this severely limited economic growth in the United States. Thanks, Andrew Jackson. Now, as much as I'd love to wax lyrical on the profound transformation brought upon the human existence by industrialism and the advent of factories, I also don't want to bore you all to death too badly. That being said, the invention of factories was a massive deal, as I'm willing to wager most of you watching this are wearing, sitting on, and perhaps consuming goods right this second that were constructed in a factory. In fact, many of us would be hard-pressed to find very many things in our lives that weren't made by factories. Well before factories, everything was made by hand, which meant most of the things you owned and consumed back then were either made by hand or made by yourself, which meant everything you consumed, whether it was clothes, furniture, medicine, or food, was probably expensive and or hard to come by. Well, factories changed all of that. Factories employ advanced production strategies like assembly lines, which is where different people perform different parts of the construction of something, and the use of heavy, expensive machinery to make finished goods more cheaply and quickly. They first emerged in the northeastern part of the country and would emerge first in the textile industry. They would then spread to other industries like the shoe industry, where different people constructed different parts of shoes, kind of like an assembly line. They made different sizes of shoes and were able to create a greater amount of shoes for people to own. The Northeast became a hotbed for industrialism, as the region hosted nearly half of the 140,000 factories in the United States in 1860. This made sense for the Northeast, as the region had a propensity towards factories due to many good rivers for transport, as well as an early source of industrial power. The Northeast also had great harbors for shipping, as well as a need to be economically creative because agriculture wasn't very good there, unlike the South. A big reason for the massive industrial revolution in the United States were advances in technology. England sort of started the Industrial Revolution, but the U.S. quickly caught up. The United States generally offered more opportunities at economic success for technological advancement than their English counterparts, and by the 1830s, it was England trying to steal textile advancements from the United States rather than the other way around, which was the case in 1813 when Francis Cabot Lowell kind of stole the first power loom idea from England. Oh, how the tech-stealing tables have turned, eh, England? Ooh, nice one, Taft. Among these advances were interchangeable parts, which basically meant there would be the same system of sizing machine parts, so it would be easier to make and replace parts when you were building or repairing something. Before this, things like screws, nails, nuts, bolts, or any parts of a machine were just kind of randomly sized, so it was really hard to find a replacement if something broke down. But now that there was an agreed upon standardization of sizes, you could just swap something out when that thing eventually wore out, or find a new thing of the same size you needed very easily, rather than having to make the thing yourself. There were many other tech innovations during this time. Coal and wood began to replace water as power sources. Vulcanized rubber was discovered by Charles Goodyear, and this material had nearly 500 different uses, and as the name would suggest, including tires. The sewing machine was developed by Elias Howe and Isaac Singer, and nearly 4,778 new inventions had been created in the United States by 1860. But despite all the tech advancements during this time, factories still needed people to do the labor, and this need for labor would have profound impacts on nearly all facets of American society. Initially, finding factory labor was difficult, as most factory owners would only recruit native-born white workers, though not actual Native Americans because of, racism. Most native white people at that time worked in agriculture, or they worked in skilled occupations that generally paid better than what factory work had to offer. However, as American agriculture transformed and became more efficient and less labor intensive, fewer people were able to find work, so they turned to Northeast factories. Some factories would recruit whole families to work, and it was not uncommon to see mom, dad, and children all working together. This sounds nice, except when you consider that it's child labor, and it was still better than England, where factory owners would literally rent orphans to work in their factories, where the orphans were essentially slaves. But in Lowell, Massachusetts, a different system of labor was used, in which young unmarried women were recruited to work. Generally, these women lived in boarding homes near the factory, worked from sunrise to sunset, made a decent wage, left factory work after a few years when they got married, and essentially resigned to the domestic life of child rearing and homemaking. Many people objected to women working, but the factory owners of Lowell were able to provide relatively clean and suitable living conditions in boarding houses near the factories. They also provided churches, which made many people feel better about women working. But factory work was difficult for many women as they worked long hours, performed tedious and repetitive tasks all day, and had few other options of employment. We see the decline in the Lowell system as the highly competitive textile market, along with the boom and busts of the fragile American economy, essentially ruined it. Thanks, Andrew Jackson. As factories struggled, they often cut wages or cut corners on female workers' living conditions. This caused many women to organize, unionize, and take action in the form of a female mill workers' strike in 1834 and again in 1837. However, both of these workers' strikes efforts failed, but worker militancy did not. 8 years later, a female labor reform association emerged and demanded better working conditions for management and the Massachusetts state government. However, to break the efforts of early organized labor, textile factory owners started doing what countless other industrialists and entrepreneurs have done before and since this time, maximize their own profits through the use of immigrant labor to exploit all people who have to work for a living, aka the working class. As we saw earlier, immigrants were coming to the United States by the thousands, and factory owners quickly seized the opportunity presented by these newly arrived Americans. Unskilled immigrants were seen as ideal as they often didn't know the land or anyone in it to help them gain leverage against the owners. These immigrants also had few places to turn to for work due to native prejudice, and there were a ton of them, so if one immigrant worker got injured or quit due to the disgraceful working conditions they experienced, another desperate man was eager to take his spot. This allowed owners to pay workers next to nothing to do work in conditions that were often appalling and disgusting. The only people who might have had it worse than the male immigrant workers were the female and child immigrant workers, as they were paid even less. And, of course, the enslaved Africans living in the South. Yay, free market laissez-faire capitalism. Whoa, Taft. Easy with the C word. This is America. You can't just say anything you want. Mill workers often suffered with the transition of the American economy, but we see that skilled workers, aka artisans, also suffered hardship. Before factories, many skilled workers provided basic things that people might need. Need a hat? Go see the town hat maker. Need some boots? Go see the town cordwainer. A cordwainer was a person who made high-quality boots and shoes. Well, with factories churning out these goods cheaply thanks to the deskilling of the American economy, these skilled artisans were in danger of losing their businesses. In response to this, many formed unions, and we see the first national trade unions emerge. However, many of these early trade unions failed as most laws and courts were hostile to their cause. And to be honest, their cause of economic self-preservation was in trouble thanks to a phenomenon known as creative destruction, which is when certain sectors of the economy are destroyed because of innovation. Think of all those poor workers at music stores like Camelot and Tower Records and Sam Goody that lost their jobs because of the dang internet. And considering most of you watching this don't know life without the internet and have no recollection of life without the internet, I probably sound a little bit like a crazy old man. No, Taft, I am very sane and very young. Thank you very much. It's important to note that unions were and are supposed to function to advocate for workers' rights in the form of fair and safe working condition and a fair and safe wage. It's also worth noting that working people usually don't have much power or wealth to begin with, so unions are the only thing most people have to advocate for their working conditions against their bosses, and this only works when all these people are united within the union, which is kind of why they're called unions, not divisions. However, early labor efforts did work for things beyond the preservation of outdated industries like better working conditions. We see this in the fight for the 10-hour workday, and in New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, this concession was won, but Not really. The law that was passed said that workers could only work 10 hours a day, but that could be extended if workers agreed to an express contract, which basically allowed owners to require workers to work more than 10 hours a day. So, to get around this, owners simply required employees to sign the express contracts, and if they didn't, they wouldn't be employees. There was a success for labor in the Commonwealth vs. Hunt Supreme Court decision, which essentially declared that labor unions were lawful organizations and that labor strikes were lawful weapons unions could use. We will see the nation's attitude on workers' rights to strike kind of go back and forth as time goes on. Unfortunately, early unions were either too small and divided to really use a strike to any degree of efficacy before the Civil War. A big reason why unions were so divided is because society was still very divided in terms of race, ethnicity, and gender. We see this as women were excluded from trade unions and had to form their own protective unions. Because of their lack of size, women's unions also had little success in dealing with their employers. In other industrial countries like England, organized labor was proving to be a veritable force within the nation, but in the United States, this was not the case. A big reason for that was the American working class was often divided by ethnicity. As more immigrants came over, a source of labor was always present to replace disgruntled striking workers. This helped make fostering tension between ethnic groups easy, which would pit workers against each other and exclude one another from union membership. As the workers had no money, no unity, and the employers had large amounts of economic, political, and social power, labor struggles then were very one-sided for the owners. But during this time, the notion of free labor was held sacred by white workers in the North. This was a concept conceived in opposition to slave labor in the South, which workers in the North were very aware of and widely regarded as the worst thing in the world. But the idea that workers, no matter what, had the freedom to pick up stakes and leave their jobs if they wanted was important to white workers, even if it wasn't totally always true for them. It's also worth noting that there were roughly 200,000 free African American workers in the North and a few in the South. These folks, though free, were still not American citizens by letter of the Constitution and were restricted from most jobs. Thanks to industrialism, America was becoming increasingly wealthy every year. But though the nation was getting wealthy, that rising tide of wealth wasn't exactly raising all boats, as a growing chasm began to emerge between the wealthy and the poor of the nation. Native Americans, enslaved African Americans, landless farm workers, and many of the unskilled workers found themselves excluded from the privileges of this growing wealth. However, a select few grew incredibly wealthy, as by 1860, roughly 5% of the families in the United States possessed more than 50% of the total wealth of the country. This disparity in wealth was very apparent in large cities. It actually still is to this day. Take a trip to the Gold Coast in Chicago, then take a trip to North Lawndale in Chicago and see what I mean. New York in particular was a place of concentrated wealth disparity. You had the super rich in places like Manhattan who commissioned the building of one of the grandest parks in all the world, Central Park. It's actually a great park. You should see it if you ever visit New York City. But within the same city, you also had people living in absolute squalor and homelessness. The urban poor were often immigrants who couldn't find work, widows, orphans, or people who suffered from addiction and or mental illness and had zero societal support. Within most cities, one would often find a small community of free African Americans who experienced brutal poverty. African Americans were, of course, barred from voting, from an education, and from most public services, and from most jobs. In the material sense, meaning their overall quality of life, many African Americans had fewer of life's comforts than the average enslaved person would have had living as an enslaved person in the South, but still, a free African American in the North had the freedom from being enslaved, which was immeasurably valuable. One would think with such a huge disparity in wealth that there would have been a great deal of class conflict in the antebellum. By the way, antebellum means before the war. War being the Civil War, in antebellum America. Interestingly enough, there was not a great deal of class conflict. This was due in large part to the fact that many of America's poor believed they had opportunities to advance up the socioeconomic ladder. A few were able to become wealthy through hard work, ingenuity, and a ton of luck, and these stories were sensibly publicized by the wealthy to encourage social compliance. There was also the prospect of being able to potentially move, buy some land out west, and start a farm, though very few urban workers even knew how to farm, let alone be able to afford to buy a farm. Many workers could also easily move around the country to either try and find better job prospects or escape awful ones. There was also the ability of many of these white male workers to vote, which gave them a sense of control over their fate of their society. Finally, there was also intense racism that prevented many of the lower classes to bond together in opposition to upper class exploitation. Which of these factors had the greatest effect is up for interpretation, but all of them definitely had an impact on preventing massive class conflict that one would see later in Europe and in Asia. Perhaps one of the greatest deterrents of social upheaval during this time and any time was the presence of a large and growing middle class. With the growth of American wealth via industrialism, a growing class of administrators, professionals, clerks, and other skilled working people emerged as well. These people weren't quite rich, but they weren't quite poor either. They were the middle class. These people generally lived in urban areas, owned their own homes, and saw men work while women stayed home and took care of the house. That is, unless they hired an immigrant woman to tend to the house for them, which is kind of the middle class woman's dream. We think that, Taft. New household inventions were all the rage back then, just as they somewhat are today. Families clamored for items like the cast iron stove, which allowed for a more controlled source of heat for warmth and cooking. Whoa! Non-hearth-based heat, Taft! Can you imagine? Ha! Yeah, they were. Growing class distinctions would emerge, which basically means it was easier to tell who was poor and who was not. To signal to people that you weren't poor in the antebellum America meant having rugs, curtains, painting on the walls of your home, wallpaper, nice furniture, dining rooms, and maybe even indoor plumbing. That's disgusting. Families changed drastically during this time as well. The idea of the family farm or the family shop or the family mill was dying a slow death as commercialism and corporatism began to take over more and more mom and pop type operations. Because of that, more families moved to seek jobs rather than seek land. This caused less wealth to be concentrated in the home, which increased the amount of kids who moved away from their parents to find work. In addition to this change, more people would work away from their homes, which created the idea of professional life and home life, or to use the modern term, work-life balance. Generally, men went off to work while women tended to the home. Then, when the workday was over, men would come home, rest from work, and enjoy their family, ideally. Now, in the days of COVID, we see the idea of professionalism and home life take on a new sort of modern, retro, pre-industrial form, as so many people are working from home, which, as we know, has its benefits as well as its limitations. Between 1800 and 1860, we also saw rapidly declining birth rates as the average amount of births a woman had went from around 7 to 5. This was due to increased birth control methods as well as increased abstinence. There was also a relatively high rate of abortions, as some historians have estimated that roughly 20% of pregnancies were terminated this way in the 1850s. As the distinction between public and private worlds emerged, as did gender norms, many of which we still see today. Men were seen as part of the public world, whereas women were relegated to the home to take part in the cult of domesticity. This is the idea that women care for the home and are essentially possessions for their husbands, as well as producers and rearers of children. Women had trouble getting divorces, still could not vote, had limited access to politics and business, could be legally beaten in many areas, and the law did not acknowledge that rape could occur within a marriage. In most communities, it was custom that women could not even speak in front of men in public. An elementary education was traditionally expected for women, but that was about where education stopped. The only college that allowed for women and men to attend together was Oberlin in Ohio, which allowed for males and females to go to class together. Ooh, scandalous. There was actually a very, very significant fear back then that if women and men went to school together, they would be too busy having sex with each other to really learn anything. Thankfully, as we all know, college men and women don't really do that sort of thing. Do they, Taft? Yeah, that's not what I've heard either. Middle-class women became very important within not only the roles of wife and mother, but also as consumer. Women would be targeted by many salespeople to get women to buy goods to help cook, clean, and entertain guests. As this growing separate, private, and domestic sphere became more embedded, a separate female culture began to emerge, and magazines and books were ready to nurture this culture. Godey's Ladies Book was one such magazine which taught women important things like fashion, homemaking, shopping, and advice on entertaining and pleasing one's husband. Politics and religion were left out of the magazine as those were considered improper for the ladies' sphere. In terms of benefits to this whole idea of a separate female society, I suppose one could say that maybe women did find some value in this feminine role of creating a morally sound and safe refuge of a home for their husbands and children from the dangerous world of brutal market capitalism. However, if you weren't married, you didn't get to enjoy the pleasure of making a home for a family. If you were a middle-class woman, you got to be a nurse, a teacher, or a housewife, as most other professions were barred from women. Working-class women, however, did not get to enjoy the cult of domesticity. They got to be workers in factories and mills, which were usually far worse than those found under the Lowell system. If women weren't doing that, they were often domestic workers like maids or cooks or nannies. Middle-class and upper-class women often saw work as unbefitting a classy lady. As for leisure, only the wealthy really got to experience widespread leisure, as most people worked 10 to 12 hours a day every day except Sunday, and Sundays were for God and rest, usually. Vacations weren't really a thing back then either, which is why people went ham on holidays like the 4th of July, because a lot of times it was the only day you got off all year. And the little bit of time off people did have, people spent it doing all sorts of things. Men would often go to taverns to drink alcohol, talk, play games, smoke, and gamble. Women weren't really allowed to go to the tavern unless they were prostitutes, so they generally would gather in one another's homes to play cards, talk, or share work on household tasks like sewing. Fun! Educated people would often read, as there were no TVs or any motion pictures back then. They would read newspapers, magazines, novels, biographies, travelogues, and other things. Women were particularly avid readers, as they weren't really allowed to do much else. Public leisure became more popular as well. Theater performances were particularly popular and would become a place for people of all cultures to see the same performance. One particularly popular type of performance was the minstrel show, which was a show in which white actors would put on black makeup and ridicule African Americans and their culture. American white people loved it because it was a very racist time back then, and ridicule is a very popular form of comedy. One of the characters from minstrel shows was named Jim Crow, which would later become the name for the system of segregation which followed the Civil War. Minstrel shows were also a big part of the reason why it's so problematic today for white people to put on makeup to look like black people. If you're a white person watching this and you're considering putting on black makeup for Halloween, just don't. Don't do it. Ever. Just don't. Bad idea. Bad. Other types of public entertainment came in the event of contests like boxing, horse racing, cockfighting, which was already becoming controversial at that time, and maybe a little bit of baseball, though professional leagues in baseball wouldn't really come until well after the Civil War. One huge figure in entertainment back then was P.T. Barnum. He would become famous for his circuses, the Barnum and Bailey Circus, but before that, he made his name with the American Museum in New York City. It was literally a freak show, and people loved it. It was something different and new and shocking. Barnum would also put on lectures where people would just sit and listen to people tell them about stuff. So on one hand, he's doing freak shows, on the other hand, he's doing lectures where you just sit there and listen to some smart guy tell you smart guy stuff. Kind of like what I'm trying to do now. What do you think of that, Taft? You're a freak show. Which brings us to our last and most exciting element of today's lecture, the agricultural North. Commercial agriculture flourished in the Northwest, which is now called the Midwest. which would drown out smaller agricultural ventures that could not compete. However, in the northeastern part of the country, agriculture declined as the soil there was not nearly as good as the Northwest, which again was called the Midwest. That's why we call it Northwestern University, because when it was founded in 1851, it was in the northwestern part of the country. What do you think of that, Taft? Yeah, go Cats! Meow! Northeastern agriculture still maintained itself through truck farming, which is basically where they grew stuff specifically to transport to and sell in the big cities. Refrigeration wasn't much of a thing, so getting fresh fruit, veggies, and dairy helped sustain agriculture in the Northeast to a degree. In the old Northwest, which again is now the Midwest, industrialism began to emerge in centers of agricultural trade like Cleveland, Cincinnati, and of course the mighty and magnificent city of Chicago. Commercial agriculture was still king in much of the Midwest, but in the northern part of the Great Lakes, hunting and fishing and some sedentary agriculture flourished as that area was still heavily dominated by Native Americans. But the southern parts of the Northwest were some of the best areas for farming in the world, still are to this day, and farmers who settled there were able to establish family farms unlike their counterparts in the East. Most farms engaged in agricultural specialization, which means they would only grow one crop and ship it out for sale on the market. However, as more of the nation engaged in industrialism, the reliance on the West for the production of agricultural products grew more and more. Meeting this demand was difficult, and farmers often had to clear more land and work longer hours. However, new agricultural technologies did more than mere labor to meet the demand. New imported breeds of livestock and different types of seeds allowed for greater food production. A new steel plow developed by inventor John Deere in Moline, Illinois, helped increase production as well, but the McCormick Reaper, as you see in the picture there, developed by Cyrus McCormick, revolutionized grain production. The machine allowed one man to harvest as much wheat as 5 men could do normally, which was quite the game changer. McCormick would establish a factory in Chicago and got disgustingly rich in the process. The wheat thresher was also invented, which exponentially increased the speed and production of wheat, which helped feed the United States. In the rural West, many saw opportunity, as it was a place where one could often start fresh and with some hard work and luck rise up the social ladder, as long as you were white and a guy. Life in rural communities was dramatically different than life in the more industrial and more urban East. Religion played a much more important role in rural communities, as church services, weddings, baptisms, and funerals were momentous occasions for public gathering. People would also gather for other rural reasons like raising a barn, baking stuff, making a quilt, or doing other old-time folksy things. People valued their rural existence over city life for many of the same reasons people do now. It was quiet, less chaotic, air was cleaner, and things seemed more stable and predictable, which can be a good thing. However, people still love to hear news from their friends in the urban world or of the world beyond their rural existence, as people, no matter whether they're rural or urban, love to hear and see things that are strange and different, whether it's news from New York City or a freak show. That's all we have for today. Thank you guys for watching. This is our 10th show, so in celebration of our 10th show, I just want to thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you guys have learned something. Maybe you've laughed once or twice. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this. Taft and I enjoy making these for you. And until next time, we gotta keep pushing, G.